Winter's deadly secret. The wind howled like 1,000 lost souls, scraping against the windows of the old farmhouse. Outside, the world was buried under a blanket of snow that stretched to the horizon. The night had come early, and the heavy, unyielding clouds smothered the last light of day. The temperature had dropped dangerously low, a sharp, bitter cold that seemed to slice through to the bone, chilling the very marrow. Lena sat by the fire, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring into the flames as if the crackling heat might chase away the creeping dread that had settled over her. The room around her was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the hearth and the flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Her breath fogged in the air, despite the fire's warmth. She shivered, but not from the cold. The house had always been quiet, but tonight it felt different. The silence was too heavy, too thick, like a weight pressing down on her chest. The wind outside had a mournful quality, as though the storm itself was a living, breathing thing, intent on reaching inside and suffocating her. She hadn't heard from Sam, her husband, since early morning when he left to check the traps. Normally he'd return by dusk, but now the shadows were stretching long across the ground, and still, there was no sign of him. Her eyes flicked to the doorway, the silence too oppressive for comfort. The house creaked and groaned under the pressure of the storm, the wooden beams seeming to whisper of things long buried in the past. Lena's fingers twitched nervously at the edge of her woolen blanket. A gnawing unease twisted in her gut, but she pushed it aside. Sam was a strong man, built like an ox, and the storm would pass soon. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. Hours had passed. Where is he? She stood, her knees stiff from sitting too long, and moved to the window. Through the frosted glass, she saw only a blur of white. The snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets, obscuring everything beyond the porch. But then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, she saw a figure. The figure stood motionless, half obscured by the falling snow, his shape barely discernible against the gray backdrop of the storm. At first, she thought it was Sam, but something felt wrong. Her heart lurched. He was standing too still, too rigid, his body outlined in a strange, unnatural way. It was as if the snow itself refused to settle around him, as though it recoiled from his presence. Lena pressed her hand to the glass, her breath fogging up the window. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. It was as if he were made of stone. "Sam?" she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response. Her heart began to race as panic unfurled in her chest. She pulled open the door, and a sharp, bitter gust of wind slapped her face. It was colder than it had been all day, an icy bite that stole the breath from her lungs. She stumbled onto the porch, her boots crunching in the deepening snow. The storm raged around her, wind cutting like daggers, snow stinging her cheeks. She squinted through the falling snow, trying to make out the figure in the distance. It looked like Sam. He wore his worn hunting coat, his boots thick with snow, but there was something wrong. His posture was too stiff, too unnatural. He wasn't moving, not at all. It was as if he were frozen, trapped in the very storm that raged around him. "Sam!" she called again, louder this time, desperation creeping into her voice. His head snapped toward her, and Lena's breath caught in her throat. His eyes, they were hollow, black pits that swallowed the light, without any recognition or warmth. His face was as pale as the snow itself, and his lips were pulled back in a grin that was more of a grimace, stretched unnaturally wide, showing too many teeth. The wind howled again, and for a moment the world seemed to go still. The only sound was the heavy thudding of Lena's heart in her chest. No, this wasn't Sam. She turned to run back to the house, her pulse pounding in her ears, but the snow beneath her feet was no longer solid. It was as if the ground had become soft, treacherous, swallowing her steps with each stride. Her legs sank deeper into the snow, and she stumbled, falling to her knees.
"Sam!"
She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the blizzard, carried away into the void. Her breath came in ragged gasps, panic flooding her senses. The wind whipped her hair into her face, and the snow stung her skin like needles. She struggled to push herself up, but the snow continued to pull her down, deeper and deeper into the earth, as though the land itself was trying to consume her. And then through the swirling darkness, she saw him again. The figure was closer now, standing just a few feet away. His smile was wide, stretching far too far across his face, and his eyes were still those black, empty pits. He wasn't Sam. He couldn't be. The man in front of her was wrong. Wrong in every possible way. Lena opened her mouth to scream, but before the sound could escape, the world around her seemed to collapse. The snow was alive, churning around her, swirling in unnatural patterns. It coiled around her legs, locking her in place. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. The snow crept higher, rising like a tide, covering her chest, her throat. The thing, stepped closer. His eyes locked on hers with an intensity that sent a cold shiver down her spine. It wasn't Sam, but something else. Something older. Something that didn't belong to this world. His mouth opened and his breath came out in a low, rasping whisper. "It's never truly cold enough," he said, his voice like the crackle of ice breaking underfoot. Lena's blood froze in her veins. No, this can't be happening. This can't be real. She fought against the snow, her hands grasping at the frozen earth, but the cold seemed to seep into her very soul, numbing her, choking her. With one last, desperate cry, she looked up at the thing that wore her husband's face, but its grin only widened, and then, crack, the world went black. When the storm finally passed, the farmhouse stood silent, abandoned. The snow-covered landscape was eerily still, as though nothing had ever been there at all. The woods were empty, the trees bent low under the weight of the snow, their limbs like skeletal fingers stretching toward the sky. The door to the farmhouse hung ajar, creaking in the wind, but there was no sign of Lena. And then, just beyond the clearing, a figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching. It was Sam, or rather what was left of him. His face was twisted into that same unnatural smile, but his eyes were gone. In their place were two black voids, endless and consuming. The snow around him seemed to shift, darkening, turning a shade of gray that didn't belong in nature. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the snow underfoot seemed to open up, swallowing the ground with every step it took. It was never cold enough, not until the last soul was taken. The storm had only just begun.